We are very happy to have Simon Buechler here today to present on the value of market signals, evidence from commercial real estate development. Thank you all, and Simon, take it away.
Thank you very much. Please feel free to interrupt me, ask any questions you have. So I'm going to present my paper on the value of market signals, evidence from commercial real estate redevelopment. This is joint work with Alex van der Mine from the University of Connecticut and Olivier Schöni from the University of Lausanne. So a common decision real investors have to make is whether to purchase a property and keep it as it is or to redevelop it. And redevelop here, we define it as a new construction on a site with pre-existing uses. And it's typically when you demolish the building and build a new one, but also residential conversion from office to residential is also redevelopment. So the value of the possibility of reconfiguring a real asset, the real option value, which is the right but not the obligation to undertake a certain investment or opportunity, a business opportunity, in this case the redevelopment, is determined by the intrinsic and the time value. The intrinsic value being the ability to generate more revenue in its new configuration, and the time value being the flexibility for investors to choose when to exercise the option. Now, despite the pervasiveness of real options in finance, virtually nothing is known about how the intrinsic value affects initial investment decisions. Most of the literature has focused on the time value. When is it optimal to extract oil? When is it optimal to start a new mine or to develop a piece of land, but not on the intrinsic redevelopment option value, which is what we estimate in this paper. Now, in this paper, we analyze which markets lead investors to, which market signals lead investors to redevelop, and how do they affect the willingness to pay via the real option value. And we consider two market signals. The first we call the capital intensity gap, which is the ratio of FAR, floor to area ratio, of nearby recently built buildings to the transacted one. Now, let me give you an example. So if you have a single family residential house with a low FAR, floor to area ratio, surrounded by nearby recently built skyscrapers with a very high FAR, this single family house is going to have a high capital intensity gap, and thus it's going to have a higher probability of redevelopment and a high redevelopment option value. That's the idea. The second market signal that we consider is what we call the type of economic activity mismatch, which is the share of nearby recently built buildings with a different economic activity. And we differentiate between offices, retail, industrial, and residential. Going back to the example, a residential house being surrounded by nearby recently built properties, skyscrapers with offices, is going to have a high economic activity mismatch, and thus a higher probability of redevelopment and a high redevelopment option value. Now, this picture here from the movie Up basically explains what we do in the paper. So if you haven't seen the movie, it's a beautiful movie, makes me cry every time. It's on Disney Plus, highly recommended. It's about this adventurer. He meets the love of his life. They grow old in this house, so when she passes away, he's reluctant to sell it. But what we see here is that this house, there are nearby recently built properties that have a much higher FAR than the house itself. So this house has a high capital intensity gap. And also, this is a residential house surrounded by what appears to be offices. So it also has a high economic activity mismatch. So this house has a very high redevelopment option value. And this is what we're going to estimate in this paper. Now, characterizing and pricing market signals that influence investment decisions via real option is challenging for several reasons. Data on the investment purpose is usually unavailable. Real estate markets have heterogeneous assets, infrequent sales, and potentially differentially informed agents. Prices are lagging, right? So if you buy a property, if a property is bought, the investors, they agree on the price months before it's actually transacted. So prices lag. So it's very hard to discern market trends only looking at transaction prices. There's also a potential reverse causality between the redevelopment likelihood and the investor's willingness to pay. because redevelopments are more risky. To buy a property and to redevelop it, it's a risky decision. And to isolate the impact of redevelopment on the investor's willingness to pay, we need to account for the microdeterminants of the asset's ability to generate revenue, the NOI, the net operating income of the asset. Now, to overcome, is there a question? No. Okay. To overcome these challenges, we first use a rich database of commercial real estate transactions in the US from 2000 to 2018. And crucially, this data contains information whether an investor purchases a property for immediate redevelopment. So we know if they're buying a property for redevelopment. Second, we focus on transactions between large institutional investors and tangible market signals. And we focus on large institutional investors because they're arguably less prone to be differentially informed. And this data set, it covers basically the universe of transactions in the United States above $2.5 million US. We develop a theoretical framework showing how to exploit these market signals in a novel identification strategy to address the reverse causality issue. And crucially, the data allows us to control for the NOI of the building, the net operating income, and buyer and seller characteristics, which we know is also important when estimating the redevelopment option value. Now, let me give you a preview of the findings. So these market signals, they strongly affect commercial real estate redevelopments. A 1 standard deviation increase in the capital intensity gap increases the probability of redevelopment by 29%, compared to 11% for capital depreciation. Capital depreciation here being the age of the building. The older the building, the higher the probability of redevelopment, and the literature has identified capital depreciation as one of the main drivers of redevelopment. What I find is that the capital intensity gap matters more than the capital depreciation. We also find that the type of economic activity mismatch also increases the propensity to redevelop, although to a lower extent. And these market signals, they spur redevelopment if they're geographically close. The further away, the weaker they become. At some point, they even become negative, meaning the part is happening over there, you should redevelop over there or not here. And we find an intrinsic value of redevelopment of up to 30% of the property transaction price. So on average, if a property is bought for immediate redevelopment, 30% is redevelopment option value of the transaction price. Now, the beauty of this exercise, also this paper, is that we can compute the redevelopment option value across time, and we can compute it across spaces. So we can compute it for many different cities in the US, and we also can estimate the redevelopment option value for all the transactions that we have in our sample. And we can map it out. And we did so for New York City. And here you see this map. You would expect more redevelopments in Midtown, the financial district, Brooklyn, and Queens. And since we got this data for RCA, they were bought out by MSCI. But we're working, or RCA was funding my lab. We went down there to New York to present this to some developers and to the people at RCA, Real Capital Analytics. And it was very reassuring to see that they agreed with this map. So they thought, yeah, this is exactly what we're seeing in real life. This is where you expect redevelopment. So I think we're capturing something right here. I think it's also very important for policymakers because it provides insights where to stimulate and expect investments in urban renewal, especially in times like now where we have New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco with 40 to 60% empty offices. So I think having this mapped out, having this redevelopment option value for all these transactions is a very powerful tool.
Hey, Simon.
So, yes, please, Dave.
And feel free to answer this question later. What kind of data information do you have on how hard it is to redevelop in an area? So my wife as an architect and used to work in Manhattan, and it's just exceptionally difficult to redevelop anything in Manhattan because everything is so dense and you can't make any noise during regular hours.
This is an excellent question, and you bring up New York. I actually mapped New York, but New York is the biggest exception because it's as you say, it's it's very hard to redevelop. So we cannot control for land use regulation. We don't have the data on land use regulation. I know there's data in New York, and we've been trying to get it, but we don't have it for the whole of the U.S. And there is, as far as I know, there's no comprehensive data on land use regulation in for the whole of the US. What we do is we control for county fixed effects, which is the best what we can do. Still in New York, you know, you have buildings. What we assume is that if somebody is building a skyscraper next to you, you're going to be able to build a skyscraper too. And in New York, this is many cases not the time. You know, some buildings they sell their air rights. So, you know, even if you're quit building, you're not going to be able to redevelop. It's costly to redevelop. You have the noise, you have regulation. So those are a caveat that we have. So again, I map New York. Maybe I should map Dallas, where these caveats are not that big, where you can just build wherever you want. But this is a caveat. The best what I can do is control at the county fixed effect. And the other thing is there are some papers by David Leder showing that if people build next to you in New York, you can lobby also for a change in land use regulation. So at the end, you can also increase the FAR as your neighbors were doing. And in many times, this is granted. So I don't think it's completely wrong, but yes, it is a point that we cannot control for. And we actually want to do a follow-up paper where we get the regulation data and do exactly the same, taking into account the regulation data in New York. But yeah, we'll have to wait. Does this answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, it sure does. Thank you.
Perfect. So how do we add to the literature? We find that tangible market signals represent a valuable information externality for other investors, as theorized by the Grenadier and Co-author papers, where they analyze strategic exercise of real options in real estate markets, but also in corporate finance. We establish a new link between market signals and the real options framework, as the Kaposa-Lee papers, where they look at the optimal land development decision. We expand the literature investigating real options empirically. The CARE looked when is it optimal to extract gas. Kellogg looked where is it optimal to extract oil. Moyle and Tufano, when is it optimal to do a new mine. And Quick, when is it optimal to develop a land. As I already mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, what's crucially different here is that we look at the intrinsic redevelopment option value, and we don't look at the time value as those papers. We also establish a link between the redevelopment of residential properties and land value, as the Munich and Diamond Macmillan paper. And we add to the literature showing that how the option value to redevelop a property might affect the valuations of its hedonic characteristic. So the John Clapp and co-authors, and also Munich and Womack, they showed that without accounting for the redevelopment option value, if you run a hedonic model, you're going to have biases on the different estimates. So you have to account for a redevelopment option value. So we also add to this literature. So we contribute to this literature by investigating how real options might affect initial investment decisions by commercial real estate investors. We quantify the importance of tangible market signals, and we implement a novel empirical identification strategy allowing to assess how much investors value the possibility of redeveloping the real estate asset. So let me walk you through the theoretical framework. It's a very simple model. We built on the work of Kaposa and Lee and John Clapp and Salavey, where P here denotes the value of commercial property I at time T that was built at time 0. The property generates a periodic net operating income, YC, where Y denotes the net operating income per unit of building capacity, and C is the total building capacity. Now C follows a very simple Cobb-Douglas production function where the inputs are land and capital, and we have a total factor productivity, and alpha is the land output elasticity. Now, if we divide C by the land, the capital by the land, we get a capital to land ratio, which is our measure of capital intensity. This is our measure for FAR, if you want so. So the floor to area ratio, basically how many floors you build, it's a measure of the capital, and the land. So our capital intensity is our proxy for the FAR. Now let PN denote the price of a given property that is never redeveloped, and PR the price of a property that's redeveloped once. So the price is given by the price of a property that's never redeveloped plus some redevelopment option value, which is maximizing 0 if the redevelopment option value is 0, or the redevelopment option value. So the land component of the building capacity is time invariant, whereas the capital investment component depreciates as a constant rate rho. So we have capital depreciation, buildings become older, there's some, depreciation going on, also economic depreciation. And we use a very simple Gordon growth model setting where R denotes the risk-adjusted rate and G the expected income growth rate. So using a standard present value approach, the value of a property built at time 0 that is never redeveloped is given by this term here. And as you can see, it depends on this measure of capital intensity, the FAR. Now, we can reformulate that and show that the price of a property is given by a price of a property that is never redeveloped plus some redevelopment potential associated with this property. And this redevelopment potential, this term here, is an increasing function of the highest and best income to current income ratio. So Y here is the current income, the NOI of the property itself, and Y star is the highest and best income that you could get at this location. So basically, if you can redevelop the property and you can increase your NOI, you will have some redevelopment potential. The second one is the highest and best use capital intensity to current one. Again, S here is the FAR of the property itself. S star is the highest and best use FAR that you could get if you redevelop a property. So if you could redevelop this property and increase the floor to area ratio, this property is going to have a redevelopment option value, redevelopment potential. And the redevelopment potential is a decreasing function of age. The older the building, the more depreciation you have, so the higher the redevelopment potential. Now, using 1 and 2, we can obtain a log-log hedonic specification for property I at time t, which incorporates a term for the redevelopment potential. And this is given by the left-hand side here, log transaction price. And now we know from our theoretical framework that we're going to have to control for the NOI, for log of NOI. We're going to control for the log FAR. We're going to control for the age of the building, the capital depreciation, for the land. And this here will give us the redevelopment potential, will give us the redevelopment option value if we could estimate this. Now, the thing is, we don't observe the redevelopment option value. What we do observe is a dummy if a property is bought for redevelopment or not. 1 if a property is bought for redevelopment, 0 otherwise. Now, in an ideal world, we would like to estimate this function here. So on the left-hand side, transaction prices. On the right-hand side, our redevelopment dummy, conditional on all the controls that we already saw. So, and beta 1 would give us the redevelopment option value. Now, we don't think omitted variables should be a problem because we can control for a bunch of characteristics, as you will see in a second. Also sample selection. We basically have the universe of the transactions, 99% in New York, 95 to 99% in the rest of the country. So we don't think it's an issue, but we know that reverse causality is an issue. Investors, they are more reluctant to redevelop more pricey properties because they have a higher financial exposure. And as we also show in the paper, lenders, they are more likely to reject mortgage application and charge higher rates. So we got some mortgage data and we show that investors buying a property for redevelopment, they pay higher mortgage rates, they get shorter loans and a higher loan to value ratio. So to account for that, because it was bias our estimate down, this would bias our beta down here, we need an instrument. And the instruments we're going to use here is our two market signals. The capital intensity gap, again, the ratio between floor to area ratios of recently nearby built properties to the transacted one, and the type of economic activity mismatch. The share of recently built nearby properties that have a different type of economic activity, residential, industrial, office, and retail. So two important remarks here. The first one is that we assume that all the developers built to the highest and best use and maximize the profit. So there are no vanity projects. Everything that we observe, so if a building is built next to you, this developer is building it to the highest and best use. And to compute these instruments, these market signals, we use information on the 10 closest buildings, new buildings, transacted within 5 years. So each building, we take the 10 closest building. On average, the distance is 2.5 kilometers. And we weigh the signal by the inverse of the distance to the building itself. There are places like Wichita, Kansas, where you don't have 10 transactions around every transaction. So these transactions, they drop from our sample. And to give you an idea, we have around 200,000 transactions from 2000 to 2018, and we end up, for our estimation, with 83,000 because many drop because they don't have enough. They don't have these 10 closest buildings where we can extract this signal. We can compute the capital intensity gap and the type of economic activity mismatch. We look within 5 years, so 0 to 5 years back, because 5 years is the average. So the typical time that up to 5 years is the typical time that it can take to construct a commercial building. And we correct using an index, an RCA index, for the difference in years, of course. So,
Simon?
Yes, please.
Can I ask a question? Can you talk a little bit about a potential measurement error in this redevelopment flag? I mean, do you trust it completely? Is there reason to worry? People might say they're going to redevelop a property and then not, or they say they won't and then they do.
So this is a great question. So I can, for the transactions, so I only have transactions data, and I see if a property is bought for immediate redevelopment. Now, if the property is sold in the future again, it shows up again, and I can check if it was actually redeveloped. Now, we did that. This is a small sample, so we have around 3,300 redevelopments, and of those, I think it's 2% or something like that we actually see transacted again, and we can check if they were redeveloped. Yes, they were all redeveloped. We did some Google checks where you go with Google and see it, but we didn't do it for the 3,300. So I still have to put an RA on that. But there is no incentives for them to say they're going to redevelop and don't redevelop. So because if they say, I'm going to buy a property for immediate redevelopment, and they don't do it, they just end up paying higher mortgage rates and getting worse deals for their loan. I mean, Of course, it might be that, just a crisis hits and they actually don't do it because they don't get the money or whatever. But so they don't have an incentive to lie. On the other hand, if they buy a property and they say, I'm not going to redevelop, most of the mortgage contracts, they have a clause in it saying that they're not allowed to redevelop because they didn't say so. So by 98%. So if you would have to go back to your mortgage lender and renegotiate and say, look, it makes sense to redevelop and so on. There are cases which this is possible, but in most cases, so they would have to say it. So this is my answer. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, it's a great answer. Thank you.
Perfect. So going back to New York City, you see that most of the redevelopments happened in Manhattan itself. Again, you have a bit of in Brooklyn and Queens. And here we depict our two instruments, our two market signals. And on the left-hand side, you see the capital intensity gap. And the right-hand side, you see the economic activity mismatch. I think the first thing that's striking is that they don't correlate a lot with each other. So they're capturing something else. We also see that when we use, in appendix, we run a two-stage least square using the instruments directly. We can do an over-identification test, and we pass the over-identification test 0.2, so comfortably, not a problem. Also, when we use the instruments separately, so we use one instrument and estimate the redevelopment option value and then use the other one, the results are very similar. So, which is also an affirmation that, they work and they're capturing that we actually capturing the redevelopment option value. So there are two very important identification assumptions. And the first one is that investors, they consider market signals only valuable only via the real option attached to the asset. And this identification assumption is violated if recent nearby developments exert a positive or negative externality on the building's value, right? If you build a building next to you, it will probably have some positive or negative externalities. So to internalize these positive and negative externalities, we control for the NOI of the building itself. The idea being that if it has a positive or negative externality, it gets capitalized into the rent that you're charging, which makes intuitive sense because the price of a property is nothing else than the rents divided by some interest rates and growth expectations. So this is how we deal with the first identification assumption. The second is that market signals are unrelated to price on observables, conditional on our set of controls. And this is violated if price relevant investor characteristics correlate with market signals. Now, for example, we know from other papers that some foreign investors, they overpay for commercial real estate because they have other incentives. They want to park money in a safe haven. So we know that Russian money and Chinese money flowing into US, sometimes they overpay because they actually just care more of having this property in a country that's considered a safe haven. So to deal with this, we control for several buyer characteristics, also buyer and sellers actually. We have the capitalization type. So are they a hedge fund? Are they a developer? Are they a pension fund? Investors' geographic scope. Do they invest locally, nationally, North America, internationally? And whether an investor is foreign or not, which is crucial. Now, let me walk you through the three-step estimation strategy. So first, we estimate the redevelopment probability. So we run a probit model. On the left-hand side, we have our redevelopment dummy. On the right-hand side, we have our controls and a bunch of our instruments and a bunch of controls. So we control for year and county fixed effects, hedonic characteristics, including the NOI, the FAR that we saw that's important, the land size, the age, the amount of units, the type of building, and so on. We control for market potential, so foot traffic, measures for foot traffic, and we control for the buyer and seller characteristics that are already mentioned. Next, we use the redevelopment probability computed with the probit model to instrument our redevelopment dummy in a two-stage least square. That's why it's a three-step procedure, right? We do a probit model, then we do the first stage of the two-stage least square, and then we do the second stage of the two-stage least square. And we instrument our redevelopment dummy using the probability of redevelopment using a probit. Now, at this point, you're going to be, Simon, why are you not just plugging in the instruments directly into the two-stage least square? And well, if you go back to your econometrics book, Wooldridge, in your graduate studies, there's a page there showing that if you want to instrument and dummy, this is a more precise way to do it. And this is why we do it. I should know the page, but I forgot. 272, something like that. So this should give us, giving the identification assumption, should give us a causal estimate for the redevelopment option value. Now, yes.
Lindsay has her hand up.
Oh.
Hi, Simon. It's Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay.
I just had a question, not about the instrument stuff, but just the your data with NOI and RCA. If I remember correctly, that sample size shrinks a lot when you're just looking at properties or transactions with NOI. And I think predominantly they are multifamily, the ones that you have NOI data for. Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, completely. So we have 30% of the transactions have NOIs, and we impute the NOIs of the other 70% of the transactions. So we impute the NOIs in looking at the nearest neighbors, which have the same type of building. So if it's an office building, it has to be an office building, using a hedonic model, controlling for all the hedonics that we have. And using also 2 years, so it has to be transacted within 2 years of the same building, and we control again using an index. We control for the difference. If it's in a different year, we adapt that, and this gives us imputed NOIs. We also run robustness that we have in an appendix, where we just compute the redevelopment option values for the NOIs that we actually do have, without the imputed ones, and the results are robust to that. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, sorry if you mentioned that before. I stepped out very briefly.
No, I haven't. Actually, I haven't.
Okay,
should have mentioned it.
Thanks so much.
So we got georeferenced transactions of U.S. commercial properties. We know if they're residential, retail, office, and industrial, provided by MSCI, former RCA, from 2000 to 2018. And it focuses on institutional investors. This is all the transactions above 2.5 million. It features commercial property characteristics such as transaction price, NOI, size of land, the FAR, year of sale, property type, location, and construction year. We also know, crucially, if a property is purchased for redevelopment or not. And we do hedonic characteristic, market potential, buyer and seller characteristics. So I wanted to show you this one. So we know the type of building, a quality indexed building's physical characteristics, the number of real estate units. We have a walk score, a retail dummy. So 5% of our properties, they have retail. So we have a dummy controlling for that. Mixed use is actually less than 1% have mixed use. We don't see that in our data. We know if it's majority office, it's going to be labeled as an office. We don't see if they have offices, retail, and a hotel. We don't see the hotel part. We know if they have retail on the bottom, and we can control for that. But for the mixed use, we don't see that in the data. We have a dummy indicating where the building is subsidized, and a dummy indicating if the building is located on an opportunity zone, which is also important. Yes. So let me show you some descriptive statistics. Panel A shows the main variables for redevelopment properties. So you see we have more than 3,000 observations. And for non-redevelopment properties, you see panel B with more than 80,000 observations. So redevelopments, they are more pricey, they're older, they have a higher NOI, a higher FAR, the land is larger, they have a higher capital intensity gap, and also a higher economic type of economic activity mismatch. There you go. You see that most of the redevelopments are offices and retail, much more than the non-redevelopment properties. Now let's look at the results. And here I show the results of the Probit model. That's the first stage in my three-stage procedure. And what we see in column 1, I control for year fixed effects, county fixed effects, hedonic characteristics. In column 2, I add the market potential. In column 3, I add the buyer and seller characteristics. And what we see is that the capital intensity gap and economic activity mismatch has a positive and statistically very significant effect on the probability of redevelopment. Also, age increases the probability of redevelopment, right? The older a building, the higher the probability to redevelop. NOI does not seem to matter. FAR increases the probability of redevelopment, and the land size also increases the probability of redevelopment. Now, let's look at how this market signals affect the probability of redevelopment. Here on the y-axis, you see the probability of redevelopment. In panel A, on the x-axis, you see the log capital intensity gap. Now, if a property has an FAR of 1 and it's surrounded by nearby recently built properties with an FAR of 1, 2, the capital intensity gap is going to be 1, taking the log 0. And if you have a 0 here, the probability of redevelopment is around 3%. Now, if the nearby recently built properties have an FAR of 12 and you have an FAR of 1, your capital intensity gap is going to be 12. Taking the log 2.5, the probability of redevelopment jumps to 8%. This is an increase of 166%. You see here the confidence intervals, the 90% confidence intervals. It's very precisely estimated, and this effect is slightly convex. So you see it's slightly increasing over time. Now in panel B, you see the economic activity mismatch. If you're a residential property surrounded by only residentials, the economic activity mismatch is going to be 0. If your probability of redevelopment is 2.5%. If your property residential property is surrounded by just other types, your probability jumps to 4.2%. This is increased by 50%. You see also the estimates that the confidence interval are a bit wider than with the capital intensity gap. It does increase the probability of redevelopment, but to a lesser extent than the capital intensity gap. I think one of the main reasons for that is that, you know, the economic activity mismatch per se, it's not clear that it should increase the probability of redevelopment, because we do see a lot of concentration in real estate. So where you have residential, you have residential and so on. So it does make sense. But there's also value of being the only restaurant in a residential area or being the only store around offices. So there are some value of complementarity, right? And this value of complementarity goes against this instrument here. This is also, I think, why it's a bit weaker. Again, Another reason is that we don't observe the mixed use, although we don't think it's a big issue, given that they're less than 1% of our sample. So here, what we look is the spatial decay of market signals. And what you see is that around 7 kilometers for our American friends here, around 4.3 miles. Now I forgot it. The market signal becomes negative, so the capital intensity gap signal becomes negative. The economic activity mismatch signal becomes negative around 25 kilometers with its 15.5 miles. So you see a spatial decay of these signals. The further you go away, the weaker they become, especially with the capital intensity gap. It becomes negative very, very fast. So, these signals, these FAR signals, they're valuable if they're very close. Otherwise, they're not valuable. And the same with the economic activity mismatch, but there it matters a bit less, becomes negative with 25 kilometers. So it's a bit bigger. So let's look at the redevelopment option value model. And in column 1, we run an OLS. And what we see is that the redevelopment option value is 0, non-statistically significant. So you see that the redevelopment option, the reverse causality is an issue here, which we have to deal with. Now, again, in column 2, we do year, county, and hedonic characteristics, year, county, fixed effects. Column 3, we add the market potential. In column 4, we add buyer and seller characteristics. And so column 4 is our preferred measure, and what we find is a redevelopment option value of 30%. So if a property is bought for immediate redevelopment, the redevelopment option value on average is 30%. What we see is that age has a negative effect, right? The older building, the lower the transaction price. NOI, of course, has a positive effect. FAR has a positive effect, and land area has a positive effect on the transaction price. Doing this 3-step procedure, we get a Kleinberg and Pop-F statistic of over 300. The rule is above 10 is fine. So, we don't have a problem with that. When we do, and we do it in the appendix, when we run at 2-stage least squares using the instruments directly, we also get a Kleinberg and Pop statistic of around 40. So we're still, it's around 40. So we're still fine. And as I already mentioned, when we do that, we can do an over-identification test, which we also pass comfortably. So in panel A, on the y-axis, you see the redevelopment option value in US dollars. On the x-axis, you see the time. And what we see is that the redevelopment option value decreased a lot in the great financial crisis, because, of course, the redevelopment option value is coupled to the value of the commercial of the property itself. Then it increased a lot, and then in 2015 it starts decreasing again. We had this figure in the appendix of the paper, but some of a reviewer asked us to put it in the main paper because he thought it was very interesting. We were a bit puzzled at the beginning to why we see a decrease in the redevelopment option value in 2015, because redevelopment option value was commercial real estate was booming in this time, but as you know, prices lag. So we started looking at volume, which is forward-looking the prices, and volume starts decreasing in 2017. Okay, so we saw what other measure there is. There's a liquidity measure also done by RCA. Some colleagues of mine did that. It just tries to see the difference between the bid and ask. So what's the difference in that? And sure enough, the liquidity measure starts decreasing in 2015 too. So these market signals, they are capturing, in a way, the trends that are happening. We know now that, commercial real estate tanked. I'm not saying I predicted the COVID crisis here, but, there's something there. So the panel B, we see the redevelopment option value and the x-axis. On the y-axis, you see the different cities. So you have on average, the highest redevelopment option value in New York City, followed by Boston, DC, Chicago, San Francisco. Now you can also look at the shares, and the shares is the highest in Milwaukee, Baltimore, Sarasota, and Boston Metro. I'm not familiar with these first three cities, but I did hear developers say that they are booming and they're, but yeah, maybe you know more than me on that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we can estimate a redevelopment option value for all of the transactions that we see. And we did map this for New York. And again, we would expect more redevelopments in Midtown, Financial, in Brooklyn, and Queens. And we did show this to developers, and they said we were spot on. So we feel very comfortable that that we're doing a good job here. Actually, we're even in talks to see if we commercialize this, because there is some interest a lot from from developers and the market to see where you have this redevelopment option value. What's the redevelopment option value? So we run a bunch of robustness. I just want to mention the four more important ones. So we partial out county fixed effects interacted with year fixed effects. This addresses the omitted variable concerns regarding investors' expectations and risk perceptions of local real estate markets. We drop the recent developments within 1,000 meters of a redevelopment, because this eliminates the possibility of these positive or negative externalities on the building value itself. Because even if we do control for NOI, maybe NOI is not capturing all of these externalities. We control for the net operating income per square meter generated by recently built nearby properties. This serves as a proxy for the value of positive or negative externalities. And we lag our market signals by an additional 5 years. So our market signals, the capital intensity gap and the economic activity mismatch, we always look back 0 to 5 years. Now what we do is looking back 5 to 10 years. The idea being that this ensures that recently nearby built properties do not exert a positive negative externality on the future NOI of existing properties. Some of these rents in commercial real estate, they're sticky. On average, the rent goes 5 to 7 years. So even if you have a positive or negative externality, it doesn't mean you immediately change the rents. So it takes time for the rents to adjust. And this lagging gives the more up to 10 years for the rents to adjust. So, you know, if it hasn't adjusted, it will adjust by then. So in order to capture these negative externalities or positive externalities, what we find is that our results are left unchanged. We also in the appendix we do a bunch of interactions. For example, with the different types, we find that the offices industrial followed by offices, retail, and residential is the order of being most prone to be redeveloped. And we do a bunch of other stuff, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna not talk about it. So in this point, let me conclude. The capital intensity gap and the type of economic activity mismatch significantly increase the probability of redevelopment. They are concurrent factors determining redevelopment. And in this paper, we provide new evidence on the effect of market signals on investment decisions. We find the intrinsic value of redevelopment is significantly positive, which shows a positive capitalization of these market signals via real options. We also show that reverse causality matters. We find evidence of investment spillovers. New investments attract redevelopment, which lead to urban renewal and growth. And I think this is not just valuable for developers, but also for policymakers, where to expect and stimulate redevelopment. We know that one of the biggest hinders of redevelopment is land use regulation, also of conversions. So I do have a paper with Lindsay and Ernesto on conversions. And regulation is the biggest issue for redevelopments and conversions. So when I talk about policymakers to stimulate, one way is they can look at these maps and see, okay, these places have a high redevelopment now option value. Let's, you know, maybe if they want to, of course, if this is something desired to lead to a renewal or to stimulate redevelopment, they can say, okay, let's lower the burden of regulation in these places. Like, let's allow, make it easier to do conversions or to do redevelopment. Especially, I think this is very attractive in cities like, again, San Francisco, LA, New York, the big cities that have very empty offices. So the market in the US is a bit, you have two strands. You have the very big cities that are suffering a lot from this work from home change, with a lot of empty offices, which also has negative effect on the retail and so on and so on, and people not wanting to live there or less than before. You have the second tier cities where people actually went more back to the offices and they're not suffering too much from them. So you have this differential, but I think for the first type of cities, this exercise is very important. Another thing that I just want to say quickly is we compute a redevelopment option for all the cities, right? But if you do it for Wichita, Kansas, I mean, every building has a redevelopment option value, unless it was just built. If it was just built, it has the highest and best use. So the redevelopment option value is 0, but at day 2, it's already going to have a redevelopment option value. But I can compute the redevelopment option value for the buildings in Wichita, Kansas, for the transactions in Wichita, Kansas, but there you have greenfields, right? So you don't usually redevelop. So there's also this question of where you want to redevelop and where you don't want to redevelop. But again, this is my paper. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Any questions from the audience?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Giro. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you? So it's really interesting, fascinating paper. And I think one of the great values of this paper is the first stage, where you predict the probability of the redevelopment based on capital intensity and other stuff. But the current variation in the predicted probability is only 10% or so. So I wonder if you could improve that explanatory power of the first stage. One idea I have is that probably, you know, capital intensity and other physical characteristics have just an indirect effect on the probability. More direct factor driving the redevelopment option is the cash flow gap, right? So, and then, for example, if you look at the capital intensity differences across different spaces, even for the same capital intensity gap, different cities can have different value gap or cash flow gap. So maybe you could add more interaction term with the capital intensity variable with some like a city size and, you know, urban location, et cetera, so that the combination of those interacted or more saturated model can better represent the cash flow gap, explaining the real option function. So, and then if you can improve that explanatory power, this model can be really useful for many policymakers and others, as you suggested.
Thank you very much for the suggestion, Giro. So a measure that we have, so if you in my model we have this NOI, highest and best use to the NOI. It's a bad instrument, so we cannot use it directly because, you know, it depends on the NOI. We have to control it, so it actually has a positive externality or not. So, but we do use it in an appendix just to show, and it does increase the probability power. But econometrically we shouldn't use it. But I really like your idea of the interaction, and it's something that I'm gonna look into, like the attractiveness of the cities interacted with the measures that we have. And thank you very much for this comment.
Thank you.
I see Lindsay.
I'm sorry, I'm still a little bit sick. Could you go back to those two side-by-side plots you had for your capital intensity versus, yeah. Oh, just missed it.
This one.
Yeah, so you had talked about some reasons why you thought the economic activity one wasn't as large in terms of its magnitude, and maybe was a little bit more noisy. But what do you, I mean, when I saw this, I thought maybe this is the role for zoning regulations, right? Like not being actually able to change the use type, even though you have different uses.
This is a very good point. Yeah, this might be, I haven't thought about that, but yes, this is a great point. It's true. We know it from the conversion paper, right?
Yes.
It's difficult to do. Yes, that's a good point. Thank you.
Yep.
So I don't do commercial real estate, but one explanation for the drop in redevelopment option value during the financial crisis is real estate related, but another is related to funding conditions. Like it was very hard to raise funding from lenders at that time. And there's a number of papers out there in like the maybe macro literature that use FOMC surprises or the taper tantrum or related events related to macroeconomic funding conditions to instrument for various things of interest. So we thought about looking at funding conditions and how that translates to option value.
So indirectly, I just looked at we looked at how the redevelopment has different finances. So financing redevelopment is harder, but we didn't plug in financing measures into the equation where we actually compute redevelopment option value. But this could be a good idea. Thank you.
Maybe a separate paper. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Simon, for a really amazing seminar. Thank you to the audience for some great questions. I hope everyone can join in 2 weeks when Sonia Gilbert from CUNY will present her paper on how the source of financing discrimination affects housing opportunities for FHA buyers. Thank you again and take care.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.